I want to live in a world where kids wake up in the middle of the night with a burning desire to get back to school to continue working on something that matters to them.
Welcome to Learning Through Technology, a K-12 EdTech podcast proudly presented by STS Education. I'm Alex Inman, founder of Educational Collaborators.
And I'm Bob Cerruti, founder of the EduTech Group. We're here to bring educators together, helping them unlock the full potential of learning through technology.
Tune in every other week as we connect with education leaders and dive deep into topics that matter to you, delivering actionable ideas straight to your school. Welcome to the show. Wow, that's a different background. Where are you today?
So I am coming to you from Phoenix, Arizona, where I'm not kidding you, it's 114 degrees. I am here actually for the ATA Martial Arts World Expo and Championships. So yeah, I practice Taekwondo.
Taekwondo champion!
I wish I could say that. Today I actually did compete for top 10 in the world. So I competed for a world championship and I finished in second. So somewhere around here is my second place medal.
Hey, that's incredible. Wow, man, you are over 9,000.
Nice. I appreciate the reference there, Alex. Yeah, it's disappointing to get so close to winning and not winning. I've been close to winning a world championship before, and I've not quite got there. And this year wasn't my year either, but I did get my time on the podium in second place and got my silver medal here. So that's what I'm doing here in Phoenix. So I competed at 8:30 this morning, wrapped that up, ate lunch, showered, and got ready for our episode today, Alex. So now that we've talked about Bob and hopefully before everybody nods off, why don't you tell us about our actual guest today?
Well, similarly to the champion who is my co-host, we have a champion of EdTech. So Gary Stager is, really one of the OGs. He's been around and leading EdTech pretty much for anyone who's still working in schools today. He really is a legend, and I can't wait to get into this conversation.
Nicely played, Alex. Nicely played.
Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you to another episode of Learning Through Technology podcast. We've got a great guest. We always have great guests, but we really have a legend with us today. So we've got Gary Stager with us. And if you listen to the episode where Bob was kind of talking to me about some of my journey, and folks knew that I was an early one-to-one person in the US, man, if you think I'm an OG, you have no idea. Gary was doing one-to-one back in Australia in like 1990 or very shortly thereafter that, and had almost a decade experience before people in the US really started to take one-to-one seriously. And I had a chance to meet Gary a long time ago, probably close to 20 years ago now, Gary, at a Microsoft Anytime Anywhere learning event where you were one of the featured speakers, if not the main keynote. And I've seen and followed you through conferences throughout then. So Gary, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Look forward to the conversation.
So Gary, I gave a little snippet of sort of my interaction with you and your history, but tell the audience a little bit about yourself because you've got quite a resume.
I like to think of myself first and foremost as a teacher educator. I'm elementary certified pre-K through 8th grade. I've taught everything from preschool through the doctoral level. I've worked at universities in teacher education and educational leadership and educational technology. As you mentioned, I've led professional development in the world's first 2 laptop schools, beginning nearly 35 years ago in 1990 in Australia, and helped the emerging one-to-one personal computing movement. But I've been working in schools for the last 42 years, trying to help teachers make sense of a world in which there are wondrous opportunities, not just to teach kids things that we've always wanted them to learn with greater efficiency or efficacy or comprehension, but to create opportunities to know and do in ways that were unimaginable otherwise. For a very long time, I've been a proponent of learning by doing, of learning through computer programming, through active use of computers as intellectual laboratories and vehicles for self-expression. In addition to the one-to-one work, I helped create one of the first online master's degree programs for Pepperdine University in the late 90s. I've been online in some form since the early 80s. And my doctoral research was based on creating a high-tech, alternative, project-based, technology-rich, troubled prison for teenagers in the state of Maine, where kids are able to work 5 hours a day uninterrupted on personally meaningful projects. And most recently, in addition to conference speaking and book publishing and teacher education, my partner, Sylvia Martinez, and I were authors of a book called Invent to Learn, Making Tinkering and Engineering in the Classroom, which has been quite successful around the world. It's now in 9 languages. And that's led us to be able to start a couple publishing companies, giving voice to other creative educators who want to share their ideas with the world. So eclectic background, but all the work is based on making the world a better place for kids.
It's awesome. Thanks so much.
So, Gary, it'll not surprise anybody who knows me that I want to talk about technology in 1990 when you started this. But in 1990, I literally got my first email address at John Carroll University, and it was, I don't know, I can't spread my arms long enough. It was roughly 100 characters long with vax dot, whatever dot. So I'm curious, you started as an elementary teacher. So how do you end up in ed tech? Like, there was no ed tech in 1990. So how does that happen?
Wow, there's a lot of really interesting ways to answer that question. First of all, I learned to program computers at a public middle school in 1975. In Wayne, New Jersey, I had Mr. Jones's class. It was a 9-week computer programming class that every kid was required to take in between baking a souffle and making a tie rack in the wood shop. As early as 62 or 64, it's hard to actually pin this down, there was a timeshare system in my school district where I grew up. And for the first time in my life, I felt intellectually powerful. I felt creatively expressive because we didn't know what was impossible. We thought anything was possible. And I spent the next 6 years in school programming a lot, teaching other kids how to program. There was a several-year period during which we never saw a piece of software that wasn't written by someone we knew directly. You mentioned your 100-character email address. You know, my partner and I are always joking about these damn kids today never had to program in 4K of RAM. So I programmed a lot in middle school and high school and was president of the computer club and things like that. And I graduated high school in 1981 thinking, well, that was fun. No one will ever have a computer. And Christmas of 81, I came home from my first semester at college. My mother said, get a summer job. I knew I could probably get a job at a camp. I applied to a number of day camps to be a music counselor. No one would hire me to be a music counselor because I couldn't play the guitar. And I should mention that I was applying for music counselor jobs because I was attending Berklee College of Music at the time, because I was told that since I wasn't very good at math in high school, I couldn't study computing.
And you didn't just go to any music school. You went to Berklee, right?
Yeah, and I had a scholarship and I tested out 2 years of theory. And I had had a very strong music education in my otherwise mediocre high school and was programming on the side and running the mainframe and such. So I applied for a number of summer camp jobs and no one would hire me because I couldn't play the guitar. When I stumbled upon a camp called Deer Kill Day Camp in Suffern, New York, and the owner of the camp said, hey, we've been wanting to do something with kids and computers. And he had a mini computer in his office. And he asked me if I could write a program to do something. And I honestly, to this day, wish I remember what the challenge was. But I wrote the program and it worked. And at 18 and a half years old, I was considered senior management level of the camp and had a staff and a budget and was teaching kids to program. So I was teaching kids to program in 1982. Shortly thereafter, I started teaching teachers how to use computers in a classroom, long before I was a teacher myself. So I've actually been working kind of in an entrepreneurial sense in educational computing before I was an actual teacher. Then when my conspicuous lack of talent caught up with me as a musician, I decided to become a school teacher. And I was interested in ed tech in the early 80s because that's where the wisest, most radical people in education were. These were folks who not only came out of places like MIT and Stanford, but more importantly, they came out of the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement and the women's movement and open education and various forms of progressive education. And so that's what appealed to me, was being around insanely smart people who thought they could change the world and were using computers as a way of adding colors to the crayon box that would make project-based learning possible in areas like mathematics, in which they'd only have ever been imaginable in language arts, social studies contexts. And so to answer the 1990 question, I had always wanted to go to Australia since I had read a book called This is Australia when I was about 8 years old. And in 1990, the World Conference on Computers and Education was in Sydney. I wrote a paper. It was accepted. I got this lovely letter that said, we liked your paper, but the 26 pages has to be 12 in the next 5 days, and which was probably the hardest writing assignment I ever had. And I had then had to figure out a way to get to Sydney. And a couple days after that, I got a letter in the mail from the American Federation for Information Processing, an organization that I had never heard of before or since. And they said, we'll pay for you to go to Sydney. And I was in a hotel with Seymour Papper and Mitchell Resnick and Brian Silverman and Steve Ocko and a bunch of my friends. And I met these insane Australians who had already provided every kid in their school with a laptop. And it was a private school called Methodist Ladies College in Melbourne, and a public school that's been lost to history called Coombaba State Primary School in Queensland on the Gold Coast. And they were committed to one-to-one computing. And they used the word personal computing in all of its meanings. And I think that was significant in the way we think about computing. And it was wholly consistent with the kinds of work that I'd already been doing of using computers, like I said, to amplify human potential, to allow kids to be more creative, more expressive, more collaborative.
Hey there, it's Sophia, executive producer for the show. You know those moments when the episode ends and you're thinking, man, I wish we could talk more about this. Well, guess what? We can. We got this amazing community over on LinkedIn. It's where we share all the good stuff, sneak peeks, cool resources, and quick activities to try out in your school. So here's what I want you to do. Grab your phone, head to LinkedIn, and search for our Learning Through Technology podcast page. Hit that follow button, and boom, you're in. Can't wait to see you there.
So I think one of the questions that sort of rattled in the back of my head from the time Bob asked that question and you sort of starting and sort of reframing that. So what is ed tech? Because you went all the way back to the 60s and you know, he's already got paper. If you're listening to this instead of watching it, he's already holding up. He's already got the paper written. So Gary, so let's start with that. Like, what is ed tech?
I have no idea. I actually wrote, "What is ed tech?" ? And I think we ought to be having that discussion, and we ought to be talking about why there are computers in education. I wrote a book that's behind me, or edited a volume called 20 Things to Do with the Computer Forward 50 that collected visions of educational computing from folks who've been around this for 50 years and looking forward to the next 50 years. We used to have this discussion. It used to not just be anything that plugged in. When people see me at ISTE now and they ask me, why are you here? I've taken to replying, I'm here to represent the values of the original landowners. I'm not interested in using computers to monitor when kids go to the bathroom or to rat on them or provide surveillance or to do payroll. I'm interested in a way that computers made me feel smart for the first time, that they opened up a way of thinking and paths to creativity and opportunity to become good at something and to engage in debugging processes and to mediate a conversation with myself. And I think a lot of that has been lost. I mean, I've got another prop here. You know, this is a book from 1980 called The Computer in the School, Tutor Tool 2T by Bob Taylor, that literally in 1980 was exploring the question of why would we have computers in schools? And I don't think we're spending enough time having that discussion. One of the things I learned from my friend and colleague and mentor, Seymour Papert, the father of educational computing, was that computers can benefit one of three constituents in schools: the system, teachers, or kids. And a clever teacher can take a technology that was intended to benefit the system or themselves and twist it a little bit, contort it a little bit to make it learner-centered. But I think the greatest return on investment is focusing on the computer to empower learners. And it's worth recognizing that the technology tends to serve one of those three masters, never more than one, and never more than one particularly well. So a lot of the discussions about ed tech just sort of throw together this soup of things that happen to have a battery or an electrical cord, as opposed to any kind of coherent intellectual set of values or pedagogical approach.
So I hear and gather that you're saying that the preferred of those three needs to be the learner.
It's the greatest return on investment, first of all.
So, Gary, I had in my notes to ask you about current trends in ed tech, but I think I want to modify that question because something you said caught my interest. Well, actually, a number of things have caught my interest, but I'll try to stick to one for the moment. You talked about the radicals in education in the 70s and early 80s. And fortunately, I'm not quite that old. My part in education in the 70s and early 80s was elementary school. But that struck me because I think you're right. Where are the radicals today? We have more power when it comes to what technology can do. We have more understanding of it. But are there really people out there who are sitting down and programming for themselves or coming up with their own curriculum based on that? I remember checking out books from the library to learn how to code my own games. And that was as a student, but I don't see that now. And what happened? Or am I wrong? Are the radicals still here and I just don't see them?
Again, it's a complex question that needs to be answered a number of ways. In 1974, David Ahl published a book called Basic Computer Games. It was the first computer book to sell 1 million copies. In 1984, my friend Dan Watt wrote a book called Learning with Logo that sold over 100,000 copies. Now, think about this. This is a book on how to teach programming to children that sold 100,000 copies in 1984. It's kind of extraordinary. I have a slide that I often share of the monthly magazine from the organization that became ISTE that had an issue in 1983 where half the articles for teachers were about teaching recursion. The standards were incredibly high. Mr. Jones, my 7th grade computer teacher, had to have been a great teacher because he had 1 or 2 teletypes in his classroom and he was able to keep 20 or 30 of us engaged. And there couldn't possibly have been an after-school workshop for him to have attended. There were no courses to take. He had to sort of figure this stuff out for himself. So there is a helplessness that's problematic. That I think one of the discussions we ought to have at some point in some venue is whether computer integration or curriculum integration has been a fool's errand. At which point do we declare failure? Like I said, I've been at this for 40 years and we're still trying to find ways to beg, bribe, cajole, trick, coerce, threaten teachers to touch the stuff. And that's not an indictment of teachers. It's an indictment of the system, particularly my work in teacher professional development and consulting with schools and my Constructing Modern Knowledge Summer Institute routinely demonstrates the confidence, competence, creativity, courage, intellect of teachers. But people can't choose from what they haven't seen. Now, for the radical part, when I was using the word radical, I was thinking more humane, more idealistic. There are radicals in education today.
Just interrupt for one. That's exactly how I took it. But I don't see that now, or am I missing that? So I understood what you were saying, and maybe I did not express it well enough to you, but that's exactly what I meant. I picture your radicals, your late people who came of age in the late 60s and early 70s who were radical in all those fronts that you talked about in changing society and the norms of a woman's role, the role of race in our society in the Vietnam War. So that's exactly how I took it.
Well, I was going to mention, I think there are radicals today, but they're radicals that I fear. And they're radicals who want to take, to use the political analogy of the moment, that who want to take us back instead of forward. I think there's a MAGA cruelty behind the explicit instruction craze. And that's going to be amplified by technology and the idea that we're going to turn to Sal Khan to solve our problems. Or just as face teacher attrition will make the profession even less desirable to teachers. That we continuously remove agency from teachers and then they become more automatized, more automatic, less thoughtful in their practice. And then the results suffer. And then we respond as a system by removing more agency from teachers. So that concerns me a great deal. I think there's a lot of interest in compliance and we're not big fans of empowerment. I mean, we give a lot of lip service to it, but student voice without power is just propaganda. And some of the stuff, I thought you were going to ask me questions about, what were the computers like in 1990? In a lot of ways, they were better than some of what we have today. I would trade a Toshiba T1000 in a classroom for an iPad, and just for the range of what was possible. And Methodist Ladies College had 1,500 laptops, and a lady named Louise, who, when your laptop broke, she patted you on the head and said, "I'm sorry, I'll call the vendor," and got it repaired for you. And that was the entire IT department. And then when IT departments emerged, they viewed their job as helping people do things that they wanted to accomplish. They said yes, as opposed to saying no. And when it comes to ed tech now, I'm really concerned with the alacrity with which people in ed tech positions are making banning and confiscation and locking and blocking more frictionless as opposed to opening things up. I think we ought to be having discussions about a domain of one's own. Every kid from about 5th grade should have their own domain and email address and space on the web. And that's how we get around the issues of who owns my intellectual property and digital twin issues that arise from AI and such. Nicholas Negroponte said about the One Laptop Per Child project, no one washes a rental car. When it's your computer, it's your space, when you're constructing knowledge in your thing, you own that knowledge, you own the thing that made that, constructed that thing, and then you take care of it. We ought to be having those discussions as opposed to yonder pouches and punishment and compliance.
Jerry, you and I are certainly in step on the getting to yes. So our company is the IT department for a number of schools, and that is literally what I share with our staff is how do we get to yes? There are things to be concerned with in the world today, but how do we get to yes? How do we get to what's best for students? So we're in step with that. I'm also a guy who thinks the best way to learn what's in the world is to allow people into the world. I don't default to block it. I default to how can we guide this so that students can learn. But this is where I want your opinion of, because you speak of radicals on the other side politically, I suppose. But my question is, your words, Sal Khan is going to save us all. But is Sal Khan, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Do we have Sal Khan because we've lost the creativity that your teacher had with 2 teletypes and 25 students? So he had to be creative in order to allow for everybody to be engaged. Did we lose that creativeness in teachers? And of course, I speak generalities, not of individual teachers. But did we lose that? And now we turn to the screen and Sal Khan and the interactive flat panel, or which was first, the chicken or the egg? Or is this just a symbiotic degradation of the classroom?
I often think of a quote that I saw at the Thomas Edison Laboratories. It was a favorite quote of Edison's. It came from Sir Joshua Reynolds, the 18th century artist, who said, "There is no expedient to which a man will not resort to avoid the real labor of thinking." I was at a session at ISTE recently where they were talking about, well, we don't want everyone programming. We need to be teaching computational fluency. And it was all this meaningless word salad. I'm like, is someone really genuinely concerned that we've overdone it with teaching kids computer science? Is there any evidence that there's been this abusive level of computer science instruction in this country? So it's sort of preposterous. Some of the assumptions need to be challenged. We always like the sort of simple, the easy, the homogenous, the standardized. Look, I have no beef with Sal Khan. There's always been people making flashcards and worksheets and workbooks. God bless them. What's different today is the access to power and capital and the ability to generalize that into a unifying theory of education. And I don't even think the politics, when I talked about the cruelty and the explicit instruction, I don't even think it's Republican, Democrat, left, right, conservative, liberal, as much it is a fundamental belief in how you see that learning occurs. And again, this comes back to my friend and colleague and mentor, Seymour Papert, who drew a distinction between instructionism and constructionism. Instructionists believe that knowledge is the direct result of having been taught. And so then you have to hire a better teacher, you have to have PD, you have to make worksheets, you have to buy a curriculum, you have to embrace the IB or the AP or the Cambridge, whatever acronym we're dealing with these days. And constructionists believe that knowledge is a consequence of experience, that a teacher creates the conditions in which children construct knowledge, in which they learn. As fundamentally, the learner learns, that learning isn't the direct result of having been taught. And so these people who are pushing explicit instruction, first of all, are really sad winners. They're sore losers because they've dominated for generations, and yet they endlessly complain that they're not being taken seriously enough. Again, there's no widespread open education where multi-age schools without walls and kids are farming and macrameing all day. This isn't happening. I work in schools all over the world. What I see instead are primary schools that look more like community colleges where every 42 minutes a bell rings and kids salivate and move on to something else, and no connections are being made between subjects, and where teachers don't get to know kids and kids don't get to know teachers and kids don't get to know each other, and projects are impossible to emerge because you have to clean up every 12 minutes and move on to something else. So there's this fantasy that we live in this world that's this sort of hippy dippy, let it all hang out, when in fact, COVID was the best reminder of what schools really were. And I think part of the chaos that we're finding ourselves in the middle of is rooted in parents getting a gutful of what school looked like in a way that they were unaware of. My kids spend 6 hours a day doing that. And in the absence of a compelling alternative vision of what schooling can be, they want to burn the sucker down. And whether it's school or ed tech, I find myself in the uncomfortable position regularly of having to defend something where 99% of it is bad. But I'm not willing to give up on schools because that's where the kids are. I'm not willing to give up on computing because I think it helps us become better humans, and it can allow for democracy to thrive and for creativity to flourish.
All right. So then what's next? I mean, we're at this age where the capital is flowing, the products are coming out mad. I made a post recently where I just said, on LinkedIn, AI, just in case 5 seconds have passed and you haven't seen another post on AI. I mean, the stuff is more pervasive than it's ever been before. And the substance behind it may be even harder and harder to find. What does the future look like?
Well, like in all good things, less is more. You go back to the definitions of computer literacy from my friend Arthur Lehrman in the 70s. He said computer literacy is the ability to make things with computers, the ability to program computers. When the laptops started in Australia, the entire point of them was to program across the curriculum for kids to be making things. They had a couple pieces of software on every computer. They didn't have a million things. So I think focusing on what you hope to do and creating the conditions for somebody to become good at something. Encounter teachers in schools routinely who say, well, we do a little Scratch. I'm like, okay, come back when you've done a lot of Scratch. Or do you have something better than the microbit? I haven't met anyone who's exhausted the capabilities of a microbit. Come back when you've exhausted the capabilities of it. It's like learning to sing or dance or write or paint. When did the kids get to dance with this stuff? When did they get good at it? When does fluency emerge? I think the future is clearly on the computational side. My colleague and friend Stephen Wolfram, probably the world's greatest living mathematician, scientist, says that for any discipline X, from art and archaeology to zoology and everything in between, there is now or there soon will be a branch of that discipline called computational X. And that's not only going to represent the frontiers of that discipline, but also probably the better paying version of it. I played tennis with a kid who's prone to seizures. He's high performing, but he's prone to seizures. And they got him through school and he graduated school and he's terribly concerned about earning a living and getting a job. And I asked him, do you know how to program? Do you know how to edit video? Everyone was sort of dealing with the school part of his life. Then no one sort of dealt with the fact that, hey, there are lots of jobs that if you had some skills, people would send money to your bedroom. And so, like I said, I think we need to cut through the morbidly obese curriculum. I'm not concerned with people who have a good product making a living. When folks point out to me, they say, oh, the problem with ed tech is, that exhibit hall, it's all about money. And you know this as well as anyone. The entire exhibit hall at the world's largest ed tech conference doesn't generate the revenue of ShamWow.
Right.
Or the Scrub Daddy.
Right.
Right. I mean, it's a lot of people Olympic diving into a kiddie pool. It's a lot of noise and fury signifying not much. And like I said, those radicals in the 80s ed tech were using computers as ways of enhancing our humanity, of reinvigorating the arts and playing with language and letting kids be mathematicians as opposed to being taught math and being historians rather than being taught history. And I think the focus is more organic. It's smaller in some ways. It's simpler.
So I get the smaller. I think I need a little help to sort of tie this together, at least make sure that I got this. So as we're going forward, the way to kind of cut through some of the noise, the way to cut through some of that is to choose fewer things to work on and exhaust them. And you said be more computational, or computational wins. Explain to me with some of the newer technologies what computational means.
Well, I'll tell you a funny anecdote. I was recently working with a lovely school in Australia. And this side of the world has changed too. I haven't done this in a long time. I used to spend 3 months in residence at a school. When I worked at Methodist Ladies College, my brief was to do anything that I thought would help make the school better. And I had complete access to the principal. Now I get hired by a school for a day. I may never meet the principal. And I was recently working for a school in Australia where I taught 4-year-olds, I taught 12th graders, I taught 240 8th graders symbolic programming for an entire school day. And the next day did 200 7th graders. I helped out with the jazz band. And one day I was meeting with their AI club or something. Of course, they have an AI club, so a group of 7th graders. And I was showing them how you can use even ChatGPT. You can ask it to make a program for you. You can say, make me an app that does so-and-so. And it will produce some code. And when you run it, you have to engage in debugging and bullshit detection and making sure it's doing the right thing. And then it becomes a generative process of you wanting to enhance it. Now make it do this. Now make it do that. I want it to run in a browser. Can you make it whatever? It's not just incremental. It's generative. As you have some success, you're inspired to test a larger hypothesis, ask a deeper question, embellish, decorate. If you're unsuccessful, you have to engage in some debugging processes. And this is the first time I had done any of this, frankly, myself, and certainly with kids. And in the course of 45 minutes or an hour, kids had done a remarkable amount of programming without ever dealing with a single piece of syntax and solved pretty sophisticated problem related to probabilistic thinking and number theory and stuff that's never in the curriculum. Okay. 2 days later, I'm running a microbit workshop, the little $15 brain board for robotics projects developed by the BBC. And I was running a family workshop because some of the most effective and successful work that I've been doing recently is running workshops for families, because when the parents can see through the eyes and the hands and the screens of their kids what's possible, they demand a different educational diet for their kids. And I was running this microbit workshop for families. I had kids from about kindergarten to 8th grade. And one of these kids who was in my AI club 2 days earlier was in the workshop. And instead of using the block-based programming environment provided by MakeCode, he wanted to work in Python. And I said, that's a bag of hurt. Why don't you just use the blocks? They're better. It's clearer. It's easier to debug. So I like Python. Well, I'm not going to argue with the kid. Fine, use Python. And it sort of occurred to me to ask him a question just off the cuff. I said, by the way, where'd you learn Python? And he said, in your class 2 days ago.
Yeah.
And my first thought was, wow, I must be that good. Because I don't know how to program in Python. But if the program is not doing what I want it to do, I'll figure out enough to fix it. And so in that case, the AI is kind of really useful. And I've been doing a lot of work. I asked ChatGPT to solve a 2nd grade math problem, and it just gave me a lot of nonsense. With complete conviction, it gave me a bunch of nonsense. And then I had to start fact checking it. And then the fact checking became cumbersome. So I wanted to write a program so I could fact check ChatGPT. And then I thought, well, how would I teach kids about this? And then I started developing activities for engaging kids and creating what David Perkins from Harvard used to call a junior version of the whole game. When you want kids to play baseball, you might give them a plastic bat. You might give them a wiffle ball. You might give them a tee. But if you ask them, what are you doing? They say, we're playing baseball. They're not just dealing with an incremental piece of it. They're playing the whole game. So what's the junior version of this whole game of this probabilistic thinking, this large language model? How do we create a tiny large language model for kids? And I went back to doing some old logo activities with kids of creating random poetry and insult generators. And then how do you evaluate the value of this information that ChatGPT is generating? And I kid you not, in every instance that I've done this with 5th graders, 7th graders, 10th graders, within 45 minutes, a kid will say to me, hey, this is just like AI. And as soon as they say that, I understand that they have a deeper understanding of artificial intelligence and generative AI than the adult buffoons who are creating the standards and policies for something that most of us haven't even touched yet. And so I'll say it one more concise way. There's a tipping point at which computers start working for you, right? That a lot of what we have kids do with computers in schools, even in the best logo cases, sort of constructivist cases of you have some idea, you communicate it to the computer. If it does it correctly, then it reinforces your own thinking. If it does it incorrectly, you have to check your thinking and engage into debugging and different strategy formation. But you're always thinking for the computer in that scenario. There's a tipping point where the computer starts working for you. And that's like the macro purpose of computers, is they should do work for us. And very few kids get to that tipping point. And I think that's something that we should be a lot more attentive to as a goal.
Power your teacher and staff professional growth with LearnEC, the ultimate professional learning hub for educators. Imagine all your training needs in one joyful place. Whether it's live events or on-demand courses, teachers and staff can track progress, earn rewards, and grow skills in a gamified environment anytime, anywhere. LearnEC allows you to leverage hundreds of existing courses or create your own. Experience the future of professional development with LearnEC. Visit educollaborators.com/learn.
Gary, you may have the longest track record of ed tech experience of anybody we've interviewed, almost sure of it. So we've met a couple of generations past since you started. With the new generation of teachers who are coming in, what would you recommend to them? What advice would you give them in, I guess, generally in teaching and also with their experience, or what they should expect or what they should do with technology?
Well, I'll say something aspirational first. I want to live in a world where kids wake up in the middle of the night with a burning desire to get back to school to continue working on something that matters to them. I think schools have an obligation to introduce children to things they don't yet know they love, and then to create the conditions by which they can get good at them. And I want teachers to wake up every morning and ask themselves, how do I make this the best 7 hours of a kid's life? And I think they should fight against the forces of doom and compliance and condescension and simplification and standardization that are all around us, and embrace the nutty kids. and seek joy and whimsy and beauty and love and democracy. I think in these perilous times, if we're not going to stand between the kids and the madness, who will? Now, from a practical standpoint, I actually heard Bill Clinton say this to school board members once. Every problem in education has been solved somewhere before. To a principal who says to me, if only we knew what to do. I say, swing by my house. I'll lend you one of the 10,000 books I own. We should read some stuff. We should recognize that we stand on the shoulders of giants. We should read stuff that was written more than 7 seconds ago. If you're interested in educational technology, you should have read or should read Seymour Pappert's The Children's Machine, Nicholas Negroponte's Being Digital, Neil Gershenfeld's When Things Start to Think, Sherry Turkle's The Second Self. It's kind of all there. If you want to know about AI in education, you want a humane vision of it, you want to create a policy statement, Chapter 7 of Seymour Pappert's 1980 book, Mindstorms, deals with AI. It talks about AI, logo, and Piaget all in one breath. And it also points out that no one actually read to Chapter 7 in Mindstorms, or they would know that. I think if you're interested in language arts, you're interested in mathematics, you're interested in history teaching, you want to create conditions for which the kids can do the things as opposed to being taught about them. And there's literature going back decades, or if not hundreds of years, on how to do that. So one of the ideas that drives a lot of my work, whether it's hanging out with jazz musicians or with kids, is the idea of legacy and continuum. And like I mentioned a moment ago, standing on the shoulders of giants, caring about what you do, continuing. And the great educators of Reggio Emilia, Italy, teach us that it's more important to learn as a group than in a group. And I'm concerned about the fact that there's no teacher magazine in America. I'm concerned that all of the professional organizations are in death spiral. I'm concerned that conferences got too big for their britches and are imploding. And I think we lose the muscle for getting together and sharing ideas and challenging one another and standing on the periphery of the circle. In 1985, I came to my first conference out here in Los Angeles. I lived in New Jersey at the time. I was just a kid. And I remember at the opening cocktail party, listening to Brian Silverman, who was responsible for making most of the programming environments for kids, and David Thornburg, one of the great pioneers of educational technology, having an argument about Ada Lovelace. And I was just on the periphery of this conversation thinking, man, if I can only talk that smart someday. If I can only know people like that, they'll all become friends and they've worked with me and for me and stuff since. But creating the conditions where you're part of a community, that you're working towards some goal that's more idealistic, that's bigger than yourself, that in the old sort of terms of scouting, leaves the campsite better than you found it, I think is really important.
I always got the most out of just small networking events. And we were doing marketing as a company. And one of my colleagues said, what should we do to kind of help make sure that our message is known? And I'm like, not make the message. What we do is we call a friend in a town or one of our collaborators and we say, hey, we're getting together at this bar or this restaurant and come and join us. And our job is to pay the bill at the end of the night. That's it. Everybody else's job is to come and listen and share and talk. And I tell you, we get so much more value out of that than we can any other sort of event. I learned how to be a tech director through those kinds of things. One last question for you, Gary. I can't believe how fast this time has gone. I really enjoyed this conversation. And we end our podcast asking our guest who their favorite or most impactful teacher is and why. You named 7 or 8 in this interview itself. So who's your favorite or most impactful teacher and why?
I could answer it a number of different ways, but I'll talk about it in a non-technical setting. 7th grade, I had a guy named Bob Prail, Mr. Prail for social studies. I often watch the news and scream at the television set, am I the only person in the world who had a decent 7th grade social studies teacher? How is it possible that you're on television or you're a U.S. senator and you don't know how this works? And Mr. Prail was the kind of teacher who undoubtedly put the needs and interests and passions and talents and concerns and skills and wants and needs of his kids ahead of himself. In the mid-1970s, our class made a film of Uncle Tom's Cabin. We had to buy the book ourselves and read it. And then we made the film, 8mm film. And another class did Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. And I remember thinking at 12 years old that, in fact, a big part of my political formation as a citizen, as a human, came from being in Mr. Prail's class and recognizing that at any moment we might have to march to save his job. Because even at 12 years old, I recognized that this teacher who cared more about us than some arbitrary list of stuff that he was supposed to teach was in peril. That message was conveyed in subtle fashions. Every time the bell rang, Mr. Trail had to pick up all his belongings and go to another classroom, even though most of the teachers in the school had their own classroom. And he did this for the rest of his career. So fast forward decades, I stayed in touch with Trail. And 10 years ago or so, he said to me, I said, how long can you do this? He said, man, I'm healthy. I can do this another 20 years. I love it. And then 6 months later, he said to me, I'm retiring. I said, what caused that? He said, well, I'd like to be able to ski or ride my bike occasionally. And just as an aside, how broken is our system that it can't keep master teachers by having some flexibility? America is the only place where you have to tell a teacher education student, a pre-service teacher, you better choose wisely because there's a very good chance you're going to retire in that classroom you start in. Right? When I go to Australia, everyone has worked 50 different places because they have job mobility and flexibility and stuff. And they team teach and they job share and they go to industry and they come back and they go to university and they come back and they go to administration, they go to classroom. In America, it's not like that. It's sort of one path through, so you have to choose wisely. Anyway, Trail announced he's retiring, and I wanted to honor him and see him one more time. In the classroom, I flew to New Jersey and I walked into his classroom unannounced. And he introduced me to the kids and we embraced, and the kids were involved in this elaborate project where they were making cartoon character puppets that were going to be in historical fiction that they were going to bring to the elementary school, and they were going to tell these historical stories through these puppets. And I didn't understand any of it, but the kids were deeply involved in this thing. And it was elaborate and it was sophisticated and it was high quality, and the kids were really cared about what was going on. And I know they were learning a ton of social studies and writing and public speaking and art and everything else. And he interrupted the kids at one moment and he said, kids, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I really apologize. But I've got a problem. I've got something on my chest that I need to share with you. And the kids all perked up because they respected him and they were listening attentively. And so we're working on this elaborate project and it's going terrifically. And I know you're really looking forward to sharing it with the community. And I know you all went out and bought your own copy of Elie Wiesel's novel, Night, and we've been reading his novel about the Holocaust. And I've been really impressed by your maturity and by the quality of the discussions we've been having with this book that's not on the syllabus, that you purchased with your own money and that you're reading in your own time. But the district says that I have to finish chapter 7 by the end of the week. And that's a real conundrum for me. So I've thought long and hard about it, and I've decided that what I'm going to do is give you an enhanced study guide for chapter 7. And one of the little girls raised her hand and earnestly asked, what's an enhanced study guide, Mr. Prail? And he said, oh, if you remember in chapter 6, I gave you a study guide which had all the questions that are going to be on the test. In the enhanced study guide, there are all the questions and all the answers of what's going to be on the test. And you're responding with a belly laugh. The kids just went back to work. And what I love about that story, and the reason why I wanted to share it with you and in your audience is, and I get emotional when I think about this, I can't help but think that 20 or 30 years later, these kids are going to be confronted by some insurmountable challenge that none of their teachers could possibly have predicted or prepared them for. And they're going to remember that time where they cared about and respected, put them ahead of some arbitrary list of nonsense. So that's what makes him one of the best teachers I've ever had. And I think a lot about good teaching and such. And I've been learning to play tennis, and that gives me an opportunity to think about teaching and learning in different ways with myself being the student again. But I think teaching being a noble profession that makes the world a better place for kids is what this is all about. And I've been interested in computing because it expands the range of colors that are possible in doing so.
Gary, thank you so much. I have so many more questions. This could last for easily 2-3 hours, but thank you so much for this. It was such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks so much.
I appreciate it, guys.
Okay, that was a lengthy episode, but my goodness, I just blinked my eyes and we were that far into it. It was crazy fast. There was so much to think about. Bob, what struck you? Lots to choose from.
So it did go really fast, and I'm not a smoker, but I feel like I need a cigarette because I need to calm down. There's a lot there to process and lots that I'd like to have talked about more. But the thing that struck me most is he said that computers unlock human potential. And I made a note of that. I made a lot of notes, most notes I've ever made during one of our podcasts. And I made a note of that. And in my head, I'd like your thoughts. I'm torn. Part of me feels like It's not like we've missed the opportunity, or we're missing the opportunity of computers, not just in education, but in society. Is what we do with computers and our phones, is it really unlocking our human potential? What do you think?
I think it can. I think a lot of times that it doesn't. And it really kind of drives into the thing that really struck me the most is that when we were talking about the ways computers should be used in the future or advice that he would give teachers, it was all about using computers to solve problems. And most of our beef about technology and education is when it's passive. That's not unique to computers. Education misses the mark when it's passive. Education hits the mark when it's active, when it's constructive, when it's collaborative, when you're building shared knowledge through challenges and problem solving. And it doesn't really matter. Yeah, I mean, Gary was doing this stuff before the internet even was publicly available. It's the process. And that's where I glean so much value out of what he had to say is in some ways what's old is new. And I think back to our revolution episode, that sort of aha moment when a student is using the computer to solve that problem, then Bob, then it has tapped that human potential. That's when it does it. For all the words that Gary had to say, and there were quite a few, it was really kind of one theme. It really was one nugget to solve all those challenges.
I think that's something for us to talk about. That's an episode for us to discuss the net of computers and technology in society and our classrooms.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good topic, either for Gary to come back, or I think for some of even his pretty remarkable list of colleagues to sort of support us with in a future episode. So, well, this one's already long enough. So, Bob, thanks so much. Until our next one.
All right, Alex.
Learning Through Technology, a K-12 EdTech podcast, is brought to you by STS Education, a Pacific OneSource company. To learn more about how educators can leverage technology to drive successful educational outcomes, check us out at www.stsed.com. Connect with us by searching for Learning Through Technology in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, or anywhere else podcasts are found. And click subscribe so you don't miss an episode. On behalf of the team at STS Education, thanks for joining us.